Hi, good afternoon. I'm just checking on the technology, making sure everything's working right. I'm so excited today to be able to share with you, hopefully either you linked in to Zoom, or if you're watching here or watching on replay. Kevin Gillen is the leading economist for real estate in Center City, and he's been so on point. I've listened to him and followed him for years. We've gone through a lot of market shifts, even going back to 2013, 2014, when we were pacing the recovery from the mortgage crisis up to and including, the horrifying challenges scary changes in the market we were facing last year. He did an in-depth analysis of pandemics and how they impact real estate historically. You can catch that on a replay. It was really amazing. He really went deep in terms of, going back to the Greeks and like ancient history in terms of pandemics and real estate. So we are in a very different place today. I have been doing a lot of reflection on where we were a year ago at this time. I think I forget the exact date, but it was around the end of March when real estate just shut down, and most of us were on Zoom calls every day, really trying to sort out what's going on, how we could possibly help our clients when we literally could not do so much as basically go outside the door, hang a lockbox or a sign or anything. So I'm going to test my technology skills here. I'm going to screen share with the Zoom and bow out, and hopefully everything will be working well. So let me mute myself and bring the presentation screen online. Look forward to hearing from you. Please drop comments, questions, and I am working on local reports for you that are more specific, and we'll chat soon.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, let's see. We have Noah here getting ready to host this event. He is one of the leaders at the KW Philly office. You can see this is my little screenshot picture. Different people. This is the Zoom room, which some people I sent the link so that you could log in via Zoom. But generally speaking with Kevin, we'll have a little intro from Noah and then get right into the meat and potatoes. Be ready to take notes. Kevin goes very detailed. I will have this, usually, I'm able to get the handouts and we will have a recording. So if you want to just sit back and relax, that's fine as well. What happened to our audio? Did have audio earlier, so I think we're working on a few technical glitches here. I'll come back on screen on the side here. While we're waiting, I'll tell you, like I said in my email this morning, if you follow my blog, I'm a little quirky. I've talked a lot about market trends changing, much like the currents in the ocean. I lived in California for many years and in Hawaii for 10 years and sold luxury real estate there. So you can't live on Kauai specifically and not be immersed in the surf culture, even if you don't surf. Like I paddled out and, kind of like baby surf, but the culture influences you, and it's certainly the ocean, learning about the ocean, because that's our playground. And some of my blog articles, I've used the analogy of what surfers do. They go to the shore, they watch the ocean, they look for trends, And, you know, sometimes the market shifts can be small little changes in the current. And we're seeing some of that, some big changes Q1 and some little changes. So we'll talk more personally about those things, and let's hear what I'm going to try
two more
again to
minutes
connect
for a
with
couple more
Kevin.
people to join, and then we can.
Told Katie that, you know, this presentation will be sort of be my, you know, standard city-centric one. I know you've got the mainline office here. I didn't realize that until last night.
Okay.
You know, I have some slides on the suburbs, but as I told Katie, you know, I'd be happy to come back in another month once I've updated my regional
I think
report.
they're trying to sort out some audio issues on the broadcast
Yep,
level
no problem.
here.
That's great.
But for today, we're going to be pretty Philly-centric.
Yep. Cool. So we'll get started in about 2 minutes, and then we'll get it going. All right, Kevin, if you're ready, I'm going to do a quick intro, and then I'll let you take over the show.
Okay.
So I think more people will be joining.
Please bear with us a second. It looks like the host site is having some audio issues.
A great
I just want to make sure
presentation.
that I'm connecting correctly. And if you have to bounce out, I understand. Let me know you're interested, and I will get you the recording that you can watch at your leisure. Love to have coffee virtually or on Zoom or FaceTime or just on the phone and talk more about the market and how that impacts your individual goals.
The BIA together. But Kevin Gillen, PhD, he's an economist as both a senior research fellow with the Lindy Institute for Urban Innovation and adjunct professor of finance at Drexel University. And today he's here to give us his quarterly state of the housing report, state of the market report. And without further this?
Sure.
Okay, then now you want to just hit record? You got it? Okay, good.
However, please don't distribute the slide deck. It's technically property of Drexel, not me.
Yep.
And it normally would be no problem, except unfortunately in the past I've run into instances where some people have taken a few of the slides and tried to pass it off on their own. And Drexel's lawyers don't care for that. And I don't need that grief, and you don't either. So
no problem. You got it.
No temptations. All right. So jumping into it, here we go. All right, our post-pandemic housing economy, where are we and where are we headed? So of course, the number one question on everyone's mind, where's our housing economy at? The short answer is next. If you think that Philadelphia's market is not only exceptionally hot, but is also unexpectedly hot, well, then you've been paying attention. In fact, if you're not making money right now, then you're doing something wrong. So let's put some numbers behind that. Next. So first, we'll look at some of the local economic factors before we look at the actual numbers for housing. So this is employment in Philadelphia. As you can see, it took a huge hit during the pandemic. You see that massive plunge on the right. I mean, it was even bigger plunge than during the last recession when the housing bubble burst. But believe it or not, the loss in employment during the pandemic was even worse than the recession that hit Philadelphia back in the 90s, where we lost about 12.5% of all jobs in the city disappeared over the course of 8 years. This time around, we had 14% of our jobs disappear in just the space of 2 months, as you can see by the steep drop in that line there. But thankfully, it's made a significant comeback. Most importantly, the bounce back that has been made has been in the jobs that you really want. The high-paid, high-paid service sector office jobs that people are working from home, not the offices, as opposed to low-level service jobs. The ones that are still rebounding are jobs in hospitality, jobs in retail, and of course jobs in the restaurant industry. But for the most part, all other jobs have made a significant rebound after that massive plunge in just the space of 2 months, which occurred 1 year ago, exactly, or today. All right, next slide. Materials costs, building materials costs have spiked though since the pandemic hit. So this just shows this is a cost index for housing construction materials in the U.S. It's just a composite index based upon the price of lumber, the price of steel, things like that. Historically, construction costs or materials costs anyway grow about 2.4% per year. You see the big surge during the housing bubble years of the 2000s. For those of you that are old enough to remember that, a few years ago, you see another spike due to Mr. Trump's tariffs that he put on the Chinese steel in particular. And then currently, however, there's been a big spike. Right now, building cost materials are up 6.4% year on year. And believe me, when I do presentations to the builders, the home builders, as opposed to the realtors, one of the top questions I get asked is, why is the cost of materials up so much, and when is it going to abate? Because they want to build, the demand is out there, but as much as house prices may be rising, the cost of development is rising just as fast. So that the builders are being squeezed, or at least being challenged. Next. Now, speaking of builders, we have been on an incredible building boom. So this shows the number of residential building permits issued in Philadelphia going back to 1990. And the black line is the population of Center City. So I break it down with green versus purple for multifamily versus single family. And as you can see the surge in building during the 2000s. That was the housing bubble. Then you see the Great Recession. Now you see where we are through the end of 2020. 2020 marked the biggest year for the most units approved for construction in Philadelphia since 1990. Now that's just through the year end 2020. I have now added the numbers for 2021 and annualized them. In other words, I'm going to show you what it's going to look like if we keep approving building permits at the current pace we've been doing so far in the first several months of 2021. Next slide. That's the same slide as the one I just showed previously. I just added the numbers for 2021. Okay. See that big spike on the right? Your eyes don't deceive you. I actually had to increase the range of the y-axis just to fit that bar. If Philadelphia keeps approving building permits at the rate it is doing, it will have approved nearly 18,000 new housing units to be constructed in Philadelphia by the end of the year. Now, that does not mean we're actually going to build 18,000 units. Many of these projects, will get delayed, they'll get canceled, they'll get scaled back. The big reason we're seeing that spike, besides the fact the market's so hot, is because, as many of you know, some major changes to the tax abatement will take effect at the end of the year. So many builders are trying to get ahead of that by getting their building permit approved before year end, even though they may have no plans to break ground for another year or two, because they want the full abatement before it basically gets cut in half once the new year rolls over and the new statute takes effect. But that huge surge that you see right there is probably the biggest year for approved new housing construction in Philadelphia since World War II. Okay, since World War II, and that's after a pandemic, which caused some people to leave the city, as well as there was some social unrest last year as well. That's an amazing statistic. So you are living in an incredible time right now for housing in the city. Next. All right, so now we'll look at prices. This is the National House Price Indices published by Schiller. House prices are up 12% nationally on the year. This is the national indices, as well as they publish an index for just the top 10 cities, top 20 largest U.S. cities, and they're up across the board. So you see that spike all the way over on the right. We've not seen annual rates of house price appreciation like this since the housing bubble 15 years ago. Now we'll look at it more locally. Next. Okay, by the way, can you see the words that are in the text box on the screen?
No, we can't, not on this slide.
No, I can't either. I'm wondering why they're disappearing, because I know they're there.
Yeah, I'm not seeing them either.
Okay, I don't know what the story is with that. I apologize for that, but I know they're there. Well, anyway, here's my house price index for Philadelphia County. This is from the quarterly report I produce every 3 months. So this index is like a Dow Jones index for the typical Philadelphia home. The index goes all the way back to 1980. And the percent change in the index over time reflects just the general percent change in the level of Philadelphia house prices over time. So this is a citywide index. And again, as you can see, that spike all the way over on the right. Right now, house prices in Philadelphia are up 12.8% on the year. In other words, the general level of house prices in Philly is 12.8% higher than it was a year ago. To put that into context, the traditional rate of return on the stock market is about 7 to 8% per year. And the traditional rate of house price appreciation in Philly is about 4 to 5% per year. So Philly is house prices are not only growing more than double their average historic rate, they're actually even beating the stock market, which is really quite an amazing thing to think about. If you give it some thought. Next, here's another statistic for you. The median house price in Philadelphia, it just crossed $200,000 for the first time, just the final months of last year. So the red line there is my house price index for Philly, and then the blue line is just the median house price index in Philly. As you can see, that line is a lot more volatile than my house price index because there's just so much seasonality and noise in raw house prices. But in November of last year, the city's median house price crossed 200,000, meaning that now half of all homes in Philadelphia have a value greater than $200,000. The last time it crossed such a threshold was back in about 2003 or 2004 when it crossed the $100,000 threshold. Next, and I don't know why things aren't showing up on the axis or in the text boxes here. So this is a 3D map showing the annual rate of change by neighborhood in Philadelphia. If we go back to the previous slide. No, there we go. And again, every county should be labeled by how much house prices grew in the last year. But this is a map of the region where each county is extruded upwards by the total change in the general level of house prices over the course of the last 12 months. And as you can see, Philadelphia in the center there is just basically like levitating over its suburban counterparts. We have seen some significant prices increase in the suburbs, especially on the main line area where many of you are. But Philadelphia completely has not only outperformed its own history this last year, it's outperformed the stock market, and it's also outperforming its own suburbs, which typically it does not do either. Next. All right, if we break that out by county, you can see the differences here. So the red line is just the median house price in Philadelphia County. And then I have the other counties with the Jersey counties in green and the Pennsylvania counties in blue. Again, I don't know why it's not showing up on the axis here. I apologize for that. But the point of this chart is if you look at it historically, you see how that red line is below the green and the blue lines? That's because the typical Philadelphia home has always been chasing its suburban values. It's always been much less. Now, that's typically true of most metro areas, not just Philly. But look at what's happened over the last 5 years. You can see that the red line, the rate of appreciation, has outpaced many of the suburban parts, particularly the Jersey, South Jersey counties, which are a much more challenging market than either the city or the Pennsylvania counties. But it's passed Salem County and almost caught up with Camden County, that the city did in terms of house price appreciation over the last several years. Next. Just shows the year-on-year change in average house prices. Now I'm going to compare Philadelphia to the 10 largest U.S. cities. So here all I'm doing is computing the annual year-on-year percent change in both my house price index for Philadelphia, which is the red line, and the annual year-on-year change in the composite index for the 10 largest U.S. cities published by Schiller. So over the course of the past year, the Philadelphia house price index is up 12.8%, whereas the composite index for the 10 largest cities is up just 10%. So why am I showing you this? Again, not only are house prices in Philly beating its own history, not only are house prices in Philly beating the stock market, not only are house prices in Philly beating the suburbs, we're even beating the 10 largest U.S. cities over the course of the last year. Not every city individual. Remember, this is an average, but you know we're doing unprecedentedly well in terms of our performance. Next. All right. Let's skip condos here. Next. Condos have been a tougher market, particularly in Center City, bottom line. Keep going here. All right, so that was prices. Let's look at home sales. Not only are prices up, but city home sales have rebounded strongly since the pandemic. And if we could just go back, I think like 2 slides. Back one more. One more. There we go. So this is home sales in Philadelphia going back to 1980. Much like prices, you can see sales activity tends to be highly cyclical. So you see the boom in the mid-'80s, the recession of the early '90s. You see a huge surge in the middle. That's the housing bubble years. At the peak of the housing bubble, we were selling about 8,000 homes every 3 months. Historically speaking, Philadelphia sees about just half that, 4,000 homes transact every 3 months. So if you look to the bars all the way on the right, if you look closely, you'll see a big plunge from Q1 to Q2. That, of course, was when the pandemic hit. This is the last spring, basically, and of course, there was the quarantine where you couldn't show any homes. And then you see the resurgence since then. We're almost back to near peak levels of where we were just a year ago, a little over a year ago. So home sales have also rebounded very strong. Next, what do you think home sales are up? If you look at $1 million home sales, they are really up. Again, another record that Philadelphia broke was the number of $1 million homes that transacted in 2020. You can see the actual number there is up around, I believe, 50. Historically speaking, about 20 homes in Philadelphia transact at a price of $1 million or more every quarter. We nearly quadrupled that in 2020. So again, $1 million home sales also set an all new record. By the way, These are just houses. It does not include condos. These are single-family dwellings only in this chart. Next slide. Post-pandemic buyers of $1 million condos, though, appear a bit more hesitant. As you can imagine, the pandemic hit high-density housing quite hard. It wasn't helped by, of course, the social unrest of last year. And so a lot of very affluent millionaire, $1 million owning condo owners, which of course tend to be relatively older people, decided to decamp the city. They've still been hesitant to jump back in. So $1 million house sales are up, but $1 million condo sales are still struggling to rebound. Next. And $1 million house sales also remain highly spatially concentrated in the city. But we did see some movement outside of Center City over the course of the last year. And again, I have to attribute that primarily to the pandemic. So this is a map showing where all $1 million house sales took place in Philadelphia in the fourth quarter of last year. I don't have this for Q1 yet because the data is not available for the city yet. They're being very slow this quarter. If I showed you a map like this a year ago, all the red dots, the $1 million home sales, will be overwhelmingly concentrated in and around Center City. You maybe have 1, 2, maybe 3 up in Chestnut Hill. Every once in a while, you'll see one in Mount Airy. But notice we had quite a proliferation, relatively speaking, in the northwest quadrant of the city. I would imagine that has to do with the shift towards and preferences toward high density living towards lower density living. You know, many people will tell you having an enclosed yard and private outdoor space in 2020 and 2021 carries a much bigger premium than it used to due to the pandemic. Next. But regional home sales of $1 million houses are also off the charts. So this just shows $1 million home sales in the Philadelphia region. So this includes the Pennsylvania counties, South Jersey, and northern Delaware. Historically speaking, you can see that typically we would have a Philadelphia share of $1 million house sales would be around 20% or so. Not so this year. Even though $1 million home sales in the city are up, Philadelphia's share of regional $1 million home sales are actually down due to the massive surge in $1 million sales out in the suburbs. So you can see that massive surge that's out there again. That's pandemic driven, from what I hear. And you guys would know this better than I do. But there's been a lot of shift in not only city households to the suburbs, but we've experienced an influx of fairly affluent households from North Jersey and the New York area who have been attracted to our relatively more affordable housing stock here. But they're still making the same income that they do up there because they're remote working or telecommuting, as you call it. So you'll want to know where the $1 million home sales are in the region. Here's a map showing them. You can see the big cluster. I'm sure to no one's surprise is out there on the main line. You see the cluster in and around Center City, but you also see central Montgomery County, northern central Bucks County. That's around the New Hope, Doylestown area. And then the cluster all the way in the very upper right-hand corner, that's actually Princeton, New Jersey, which, believe it or not, are the highest house prices in our region. The main line is not the highest house prices. Princeton, New Jersey is, you'll see $2-3 million sales on the midline, but in Princeton, which only has Princeton money, but you're basically within shot of New York, it's very common to see $4, $5, $6 million house sale prices up there. Next. So moving on to some other statistics, mortgage delinquencies, however, are way up. And this is something that I'm concerned about what's going to happen when this dam breaks. So we've had a moratorium on foreclosures and on evictions due to the pandemic. But that doesn't stop people from going delinquent on their rent or delinquent on their mortgages. So those are starting to stack up. And they're eventually going to work their way through the pipeline. And when they do, I am concerned what effect they will have on the market. The market's been very hot. I can easily see this having a very strong cooling effect once it starts to move through. When that will happen depends on how our members of Congress and our state governors will allow that to happen. So I'm not in the business of predicting it. When it will happen, but I feel relatively more confident predicting that when it does happen, you will see a cooling effect on the general level of house prices, particularly in those pockets where the incidence of delinquencies is highly concentrated. Next. So let's talk about inventories. As you know, we have an incredible shortage of inventory right now, the number of homes available for sale. So this chart shows in the bars show the number of homes available for sale in Philadelphia in every given month, going back to about 2001. And then the blue line shows the absorption rate. So it's just the number of sales in each month divided by the number of homes listed for sale in each month. So you see they move in opposite directions. When inventories are up, absorption is down, and when inventories are down, absorption is up. But right now, we are at an incredibly low level of an unprecedented and historically low level of the number of homes that are actually available for sale. That combined with high demand has driven the absorption rate up. So as you know, days on market are down as a consequence of that. Next slide. Homes are transacting at a frenetic pace, just shows the average days on market for Philadelphia homes listed for sale. As you know, historically speaking, the average days on market in a balanced market is what, about 60 homes, I believe. And right now we're down to just a little below 40 days. So again, they're trying. By the way, notice that the last time we were at this level was back in 2005 or so, and that was right before the bubble burst. Okay, so take that as you will. Next. So what exactly does this mean for prices going forward? So we have high demand and we have low supply combined with rapid turnover, and that, of course, equals a very deep seller's market. So this shows the month supply of inventory in Philadelphia right now. So as you know, typically in a balanced market, you have between 5 and 7 months of homes available for sale. Right now, we have only 1.5 months of homes available for sale, meaning, as you probably know, if no one else listed their home right now and we just continue to burn through the homes that are listed, we'd run out of homes to sell in 1.5 months. Okay, 1.5 months, well below a balanced market of 5 to 7 months. So a very, very deep seller's market right now. Next, I'll give you some math you can use going forward. So now we're just going to do a little economics here. So what does month supply of inventory right now mean for house prices going forward? So I took the month supply of inventory going back to 2001, and here's a scatter plot plotting against the annual change in house prices in the 12 months after that month. So in other words, if I took the month supply of inventory in January of 2005, I'm plotting it against the general change in house prices in Philly from 2005 to 2006. So what I'm trying to get here is how useful does current inventory forecast future house price appreciation? As you can see, there's a very strong negative relationship between these two numbers. The higher the level of inventories, the lower house price appreciation gets. In fact, when inventories get really high, like they did during the recession, where we had a 12, 14, 16-month supply of homes, house price appreciation was negative. House prices were falling. That's the right-hand part of the chart that you see there, basically covering the years 2008 to 2012. At the other end of the chart, on the left end, you see when month supply of inventory is very low, like it is right now, future house price changes tend to be very high. So, for example, when you've got a 4-month supply of homes for sale, that roughly correlates with house prices rising 10% over the next 12 months. And the equation in the upper right-hand corner of the chart makes that relationship explicit. So the letter X represents the month supply of inventory. The letter Y represents the annual change in house prices going forth. So if we plug month supply of inventory into X and just sort of solve through, it will forecast what the general change in house prices will be going forward. So let's do that. Next. So first, let's look how well this equation predicts using the last year's worth of data. All right. So 12 months ago, a year ago, April 2020, Philadelphia's month supply of inventory was 3.3 months. All right. So we're going to plug 3.3 into that equation, and the resulting number is 10.9%, meaning that the equation predicts that when you have a 3.3 month supply of inventory, house prices will rise by basically 11% over the last 12 months. How much did house prices actually rise over the last 12 months? They rose by 12.8%. Okay. So the model predicted last year, based on last year's inventory, house prices would rise 11%. They actually rose 12.8%. So not a perfect prediction, but pretty close. Remember, our historic rate of appreciation is about 4 to 5%. So the model certainly predicted we would punch well above that weight in its forecast. So now let's see how current inventories are forecasting what you can expect over the next 12 months. Next slide. So again, current month supply of inventory is 1.5 months. So we're going to plug that into the equation for X, multiply through. The prediction is 13.2%. All right. So what the model is saying, this very simple model, is that absent any other information or changes in inventory levels, you can expect Philadelphia house prices to grow by an average of another 13.2% over the next 12 months. That's an increase over the 12.8% of the last 12 months. So again, the continued decline in inventories is predicting ever galloping and accelerating house price appreciation. Now, on the face of it, that might look good, especially coming off such a challenging year like 2020. But I, as an economist, as opposed to a realtor, I'm very concerned about that, and here's why. If your house prices are growing, you want them to be growing for the right reasons, because the fundamentals that drive house prices are improving. So jobs are growing, your population is growing, household formation is growing, incomes are growing because your economy is growing. Those are all good things that will cause house prices to rise. You don't want house prices to rise because of synthetic, temporary, transitory things like low inventories. It's an artificially low level of supply that eventually is going to come back. And when it does, one of two things is going to happen, and neither of them are particularly good. either we're in for a fairly significant correction, much like we did during the bursting of the last housing bubble a little over 10 years ago. And you'll have 3 or 4 years of falling prices and people reluctant to buy because they don't want to get into a falling market. Or we're going to switch to a higher level of housing unaffordability in Philadelphia. We're going to hit a new plateau where just house prices are just generally higher than they used to be relative to household incomes. And that's not good because either housing is going to become more unaffordable, especially to low income people, or to even those who still can afford to buy, because they're paying a higher price than they would otherwise, that means they're going to have a higher percentage of their annual income being spent on housing rather than other stuff. So basically, housing is going to subtract money out of the local economy that would be circulated on other things. Because if you're spending more money on your mortgage payment or your rent payment, that's less money to spend on dining out, shopping, going to sporting events, what have you. So there'll be a shift in money in our economy towards housing, but it doesn't make anyone better off. You're just spending more on housing and hence less on other things. So your overall quality of life actually gets reduced as a consequence of it. So this is something that I and many other analysts and economists are concerned about and will be continuing to keep our eye on. Next. All right. So why are inventories so low? You guys probably know, but I present to other industry groups, so they always ask me this. So yeah, we know they're low, but why is that? Multiple reasons. Next. So we've got the conversion of millions of houses to rentals in the wake of the last housing downturn. When the housing bubble burst in the late 2000s, and a lot of people lost their homes due to foreclosures. Those foreclosures were snapped up by many investors and converted to rentals. So they've effectively been removed on the market, remaining in the rental segment of the market as opposed to the for sale market. Since the housing bubble burst, we had exceptionally low levels of new home construction over the last decade. So basically, the supply of new homes was not keeping up with the supply of homes that were lost due to depreciation or destruction or things like that. We have many baby boomers aging in place rather than downsizing to a new dwelling. As you know, the housing market is like a chain of dominoes. If one domino doesn't tip, let the other dominoes tip as well, because someone won't sell their home to allow someone to move up into that home. Those people further down the supply chain get locked into their homes because they can't become move-up buyers. So as boomers age in place, not only because they have some negative equity in their homes left over from the last recession, but also because of COVID, they're not listing their homes for sale, and that jams up the whole chain of dominoes. And also, current landlords have been reluctant to give up their income-producing properties because, as you know, the rental market's been very good right now. So they like having that cash flow. We've had pandemic-driven mortgage forbearance plans and eviction moratoriums. So again, that takes more dominoes out of the supply chain because those homes can't be freed up for sale. The pandemic, as you know this, potential sellers have been reluctant to compromise their social distancing by allowing strangers to walk through their homes. And then lastly is sort of a self-reinforcing issue here is, why sell your current home, even if you get a great price, if your choice of your next home is so restricted and prices are so high? So yeah, you can sell your current home now and get top dollar, but because there's so fewer other homes out there for you to buy, chances are you won't get the one you really want. And second of all, you're going to pay more for it than you would otherwise. So why not just wait this one out? So all these things are very different reasons why inventories are so low. But the one thing they all have in common is they're all working to incentivize current homeowners to remain in place, even if those homeowners are both willing and able to move. So we've got a jammed up chain of dominoes right now, and when they're going to start tipping is as much guess as it is science, in my opinion. Next. All right, so that's the market. Let's talk about some of the more fundamental things in the economy, particularly the pandemic, and how that has affected how the population flows have responded to the pandemic, and of course how that affects the housing market. So, have the events of 2020 affected our population, our regional population's location decisions? Have we lost a lot of people? Well, let's look at the numbers. Next. So the short answer is yes. Right, the city on net lost population in 2020, but given the pandemic and also the social unrest, the loss has not been as dramatic as you might think, or at least as much as you might have worried about. So as an academic, I go to other not industry conferences, but academic conferences. And one of the hot topics of the last year is, does the pandemic mean the end of cities? Or are we all going to live in detached homes in the suburbs now, and we're all going to telecommute to work, and we're just going to enjoy our own private outdoor space and try to avoid people and avoid parks and things like that? Is it going to be the end of cities? Well, let's take a look at what the numbers say. Next. So here's what I did. So I did a Freedom of Information inquiry to the U.S. Postal Service, right? And I said, here's what I want. Everyone who changes their address when they move has to file a change of address form with the U.S. Postal Service. And you have to give them the address you're currently at and are leaving, and of course the address you're moving to. Now, they won't give you individual addresses, but they will tabulate how many people are leaving each zip code in the U.S. in a given time period, and how many people are moving in. So they gave me for every zip code in Philadelphia, they gave me the number of households who moved out of each zip in 2020. And for every zip code in Philadelphia, they gave me the number of households who moved into each zip code in 2020. And then to that, I attached the number of the total population of each zip code based upon 2018 numbers, the most recently available, as well as the median household income in each zip code in Philadelphia, again, using 2018 numbers, courtesy of the US Census. And then I just netted the change in households in each zip code against each other to get the net change in population in each zip code in Philadelphia through year-end 2020. And here's what we found. Next. Okay, so here's the distribution of net change in the number of households across Philadelphia zip codes. Remember your statistics classes in college? Remember the bell curve distribution? Well, this is that distribution here. So what this shows is that the majority of Philadelphia zip codes experienced a net loss in population in 2020. So if you look at the upper right-hand corner of that box, there's some summary statistics there. You see the median is minus 474. That means the typical Philadelphia zip code lost 474 households on net in 2020. Let me repeat that. The typical Philadelphia zip code lost 474 households on net in 2020. It's not total loss in households, that's the net loss. So, if they gained 100 households but lost 574 households, that's a net loss of 474 households, right? So let's look at that in percent terms. So I'll divide the net loss in households in each zip by the total number of households in each zip to convert that to percents. We'll go to the next slide. So here's that distribution. Again, if we look at the median in the upper right-hand corner, you see it's minus 3.54. That means the typical Philadelphia household lost 3.5% of its population on net in 2020. Okay, again, I'll repeat that. The typical Philadelphia zip code lost 3.5% of its population in 2020. Now, how big are those numbers? What does that mean for the city going forth, and where were the losses? Because they were not uniform across the entire city. Next slide. So here's one of my favorite visuals in this presentation. This shows a map of zip codes in Philadelphia, and I color-coded them by the net change in the number of households in each zip. So zip codes that lost net population are color-coded blue, and the deeper the shade of blue, the more households that were lost. The only zip code in Philadelphia that gained population on net in 2020 was Chestnut Hill. It's the one on the upper left-hand corner there. Now, I would imagine that the fact that it has a very affluent, nice housing stock, it's a nicely wooded, shaded neighborhood. It's far from, many of the events of 2020, the social unrest I'm thinking of. You have plenty of personal space up there. I would imagine that's the primary reason for that. All other zip codes in Philadelphia on net lost population. The ones that are color-coded the darkest shade of blue lost more than 1,000 households on net, okay? So the average zip may have lost only about 470 households, but the ones that are the dark shades of blue lost between 1,000 and 2,000 households on net. Remember, all these numbers are on net. Next, so let's look at that in percent terms, and here you can really see a distinctive pattern. So again, the dark shades of blue are the zip codes that had the greatest percent loss in population, and you can see where they are. They're basically in and around Center City. So Rittenhouse Square, the Chinatown area, Fairmount, and then the zip codes adjacent to that had the biggest losses. The zip code with the biggest loss was 19103. That's Rittenhouse Square. The Rittenhouse Square zip lost 18% of its population on net in 2020. 18% population loss. One of the reasons I'm sure that the luxury condo market has been much less robust over the last year than the single-family housing market. Manayunk also, for some reason, lost a big percent of its population. I'm not sure what's going on there. That's sort of the blue sliver in the upper left-hand corner. But you see the zip codes that got off the lightest tend to be the most remote ones. So the far northeast, northwest Philadelphia, far west Philadelphia, they lost less than 2.5% of their population compared to the loss in core center city of nearly 18% of its population. All right. So I'm sure you can surmise that density was not favoring population shifts during the course of last year. Basically, households were voting with their feet to seek areas with lower density, more space, and probably what they perceived is more safety as well. Next. So what does this mean? Here, just to put that into visual relief, I then took that map, I extruded it into 3D. So each zip code is extruded upwards by its total loss in population. And again, you can really see how the center city area jumps out at you, is that's where the population losses were the most concentrated, plus Manayunk there, that the long blue thing you see in the upper left-hand corner. The rest of the city got off fairly light. Next. All right, so what does that numbers mean for the city's economy and for housing? Next. So here's what I did. I'm going to take the net change in households in each zip and multiply it times the median household income in each zip. So I have the total household income in each zip. I'm going to try to compute how this population shift affected the wage tax revenue collections here, how it will affect wage tax revenue. For those of you that don't know, Philadelphia is heavily reliant on the wage tax. About half of all city revenues come from the wage tax. The remaining percent of revenues come from the property taxes, the transfer tax, sales tax, things like that. But the wage Philly is heavily reliant on the wage tax. So losing population, losing households is going to affect city revenue. So to get a handle on how much that was, I matched up median household income in each zip to the net change in households in each zip, multiplied the two times against each other. That gives me the total loss in household income in each zip. I then multiply that number times the city's wage tax rate of 3.8712%. And then I sum that number across all the city's zips to get a total projected loss in wage tax revenue as a result of those households vacating the city and taking their incomes with them. Next. And here's what it looks like. So here's a table of every zip code in the city, and I attach the name of the neighborhood of that zip code. And it's sorted on the total net loss in population in descending order. So you see at the top of the list is zip code 19102. I'll call it Rittenhouse Square, but it's also 19103. Those had the two biggest losses in population in 2020. You see it's 19102 lost 18.6% of its population. 19103 lost 11.8% of its population. Multiplying the total number of lost in households times their annual income. Of course, these are very high income zip codes. In median household income is about $75,000 in these two zips. That gives the total loss in income. Multiply that times the city's wage tax rate, and that gives me the projected loss in wage tax revenue in that zip code. So you see zip code 19102 that's projected to produce about $1.2 million less in wage tax revenue as a result of that population loss. 19103, the bigger one containing Rittenhouse Square, is projected to lose about $5.7 million in revenue as a result of those households vacating. So that final column on the right, I just sum that column, which is the total projected loss in wage tax revenues in each. Bottom line, the city is projected to lose about $48 million in annual wage tax revenue collections as a result of the pandemic driving people out of the city. So to put that number in context, how much is $48 million? It's a lot to you and me, but maybe not so much for the city. The city's annual wage tax revenue is about $2 billion. Okay, $2 billion is what the city typically collects annually in wage taxes. They're going to take a $48 million haircut to that. How big is that? It's 2.4%. Okay, 2.4% reduction in wage tax revenue collection. So
is it really that high? Because didn't some of the people that moved out still work in the city and pay wage
yes,
tax?
that's what we don't know. But they still changed their addresses, so these are the numbers that we had to go. We also know that some people are coming back, right? I particularly hear this in the condo segment. A lot of those more affluent elderly homeowners, they just went to their home at the shore or their condo in Florida, and they'll come back when they feel like it. I bet some of them already are coming back. But again, even if all those households that changed their addresses are a total loss, we only get a hit to our wage tax revenue of 2.4%, which I would say is not really the end of the world, right? It's not 10%, it's not 20%. So again, to put that into context, next slide. Here's a story from NBC 10. You just mentioned remote work. It was a perfect segue to this. So how much money are we projected to lose from people doing remote work? Because even if your work address in the city is the same, but you're working from home, in other words, your employer's address in the city is the same, but you're now working from a home in the suburbs, people are now saying, well, then you shouldn't have to pay the wage tax revenue because you're not physically commuting to your job. You're working from home, therefore you should be exempt from it. So NBC 10 did an analysis of this. They found that due to the loss in the non-resident wage tax rate as a result of people working remotely as a consequence of the pandemic, they're expecting a 5% decrease in revenue, or about $100 million hit to the city's coffers. So due to the direct population loss, I'm projecting a 2.5% loss in revenue. But due to the shift to remote working, that's going to be a 5% loss in wage tax revenue for a total loss of 7.5%. But think about what this means. People remember a year ago, people were talking about, well, everyone's going to leave the city. This is the end of the cities as we know it. The loss to the city due to the shift in remote working is projected to be double that of the loss due to people actually physically relocating from the city. Think about that. The structural shift in how we work is going to have a bigger impact on the city, and I would argue on all cities, than the loss in actual population itself, because some of that population is going to come back. In fact, we know that they already are. So I find that to be a remarkable fact, because that represents not just a change in the fiscal condition of our cities due to cyclical factors like recessions, but due to a structural factor, which is a much longer term thing than a cyclical factor. Cycles come back. Structural shifts tend to be long, if not long term, if not permanent, at least long term. So the change in how we work is going to be more impactful to our cities and our housing markets than the change in just how our population has reshuffled itself around the country in reaction to the pandemic, which I find to be a fascinating and remarkable find. Next. So next, that just summarizes it. Summing this up, next. All right, housing is hot. You know that. It's almost certainly better than anyone could have expected, certainly a year ago. You know how challenging things were. If you asked anyone, including me, a year ago, what things will be like now, I don't think anyone would predict how hot things are. But like I said, this may be good for business right now, but as an economist, I'm concerned that this is hot for not only the wrong reasons, that is, synthetic reasons like inventory shortages, but also for very short-term reasons. Interest rates and foreclosures and inventories are eventually going to rise, and the shift of work from offices to homes is going to at least partially revert back. So those things are going to have a cooling effect when they come through. Difficult to predict when they will, but I think fairly confidently predict that eventually they will. But more positively, if you consider all the terrible events of 2020, the majority of Philadelphians still seem committed to remaining as Philadelphians. They have not fled the city. The city has gotten through this. It's going to need all that federal aid from the stimulus packages to cover all those losses in revenues. But its population has still decided to remain committed to the city's long term. And I would argue that's not only good for the city, it's good for the region as well. So with that, next, I say thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I'll do my best to answer them.
Cool. If you have a question for Kevin, just unmute yourself or put it in the chat box if you don't want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I have a question about the mortgage delinquencies.
Yep.
Where is that information coming from? Because I've heard that is something that is being kept like very much right now. Like none of the banks are allowing people to know how many delinquencies there are at this moment.
It's tracked by the Mortgage Bankers Association. They produce those numbers monthly.
Say that again.
It's published by the Mortgage Bankers Association. You can get it
Gotcha.
from the website.
Okay. And how do you feel that will affect the supply? I mean, do you think a lot of those people, I guess, I don't know if there's, based on what happened previously, if there's a percentage that will either sell or a percentage that just goes to foreclosure?
Yeah, that's a good question. So here's what happened last time when the housing bubble burst, all right? Now, that downturn is different than what the next one will be, because during the last downturn was actually caused by way too much cheap and available financing. Some of you may remember, if you just had, a pulse, you could get a mortgage, 15 years ago. Credit underwriting standards have been significantly tighter since then, okay? So when the last one happened, people who were over leveraged, who bought at the peak of the market, paid more than they should have, house prices started dropping fast. They got underwater really fast, okay? They were in a negative equity position. So what happened to them was that they either were foreclosed upon, or they just had to sell their homes at a very fire sale type price. That's not predicted to happen this time around, because we're not seeing nearly the levels of over leveraging or speculation that we saw last time around. The last downturn hit low income and especially urban minority households the hardest, because they were the ones who were doing all the subprime lending, taking the quickie loans and things like that. We don't see that this time around. So we do know how many delinquencies there are out there, but unfortunately, we don't know who those people are. We don't know where they are. We just know the aggregate numbers nationally. And sometimes you get them at the state level, but that's about it. So the foreclosures that happened last time fell disproportionately upon sort of inner city areas and lower income suburbs, and those were a lot of the homes that were snapped up and converted to income properties as rentals, and they're remaining so as today. So we're not expecting anything like that, because we're not seeing the degrees of over leverage. But like I said, we don't know who these households are that are going delinquent. So I would imagine, rather than seeing massive waves of foreclosures, I would think we'd just see these people sell their homes, and that would, I would imagine, would produce a slower moving downturn than what happened last time, where suddenly things just went into free fall very fast because people don't feel the pressure to sell. I think, you know, when the next softening happens, and they did during the last one, which was actually a crash, not a softening. So that's the best I can predict.
Have you done like similar studies to the commercial sector?
I have not. I often co-present with the people who do that. So these are the people that are with the major commercial brokerages like Jones Lang LaSalle and CB Richard Ellis. They have a slide deck just like mine, but for the office and the industrial warehouse sector. If you want, I can shoot me an email. I can put you in touch with them because they typically make those slide decks available to the public.
The condos on the condo front, if the sales are weak and you're not having the people come in, and you said permits are really up, it seems like construction continues. Is that going to present a weak spot going forward?
You mean for condos or just generally?
Yeah, for condos. Like
no, actually no. Here's why. The last building movement that we had in the 2000s, all the multifamily product was overwhelmingly condo centric. This time around, it's apartment centric. So most of those units you see being built in multifamily, as opposed to single family, are mostly apartment buildings, not condos. And since most condo owners tend to be more affluent than apartment renters, unless we see a huge shift in condo owners suddenly wanting to rent, no, I would not project a softening in the condo segment. I would worry a bit about a softening in the multifamily segment because, as I just showed you, even though our population loss on net might have been small, if you're adding a lot of new houses to your stock at a time when you're still losing a bit of population, it begs the question, who's going to be living in those units? So for those households that left, which I would imagine would be mostly families or older couples, whereas most multifamily products being built for either single millennials or millennial couples, those are two different types of households with two different types of housing preferences. So I hope we attract enough of those new young households to occupy those apartments. That would be my concern.
So would it be a fair assessment to say, to an investor client, we could guide you to the best region of the area by determining the least amount of people who left with the highest amount of median income?
Are you selling houses or condos?
Like houses or multifamily specifically.
Okay. Like I said, we know how many households left each zip code, but again, we don't know much about them. All we know is the median household income in each zip. So we know that the biggest loss was Core Center City. And Core Center City is primarily affluent empty nesters, or singles, or two-person households with no kids. I mean, we do see kids in Center City, but it's not as family oriented as the other outer neighborhoods are, right? So I'd imagine that it's disproportionately that type of household that's left Center City. But if you're trying to move apartment product as a leasing agent, but most of your losses in that zip code has been in affluent homeowners as opposed to apartment dwellers, you're in a different segment of the market than those households who left.
Also, how do you determine the difference of somebody leaving that zip code if they're a renter versus owner? Can you even do that?
No, unfortunately. All we know is just how many left and how many moved in. That's it.
Okay.
Kevin, I have a question for you. As far as mortgage forbearance and trying to track the number of, or the percent, however those are performing, those mortgages are performing, what the delinquency rates are on them. I've heard that like Fannie Mae mortgages have these forbearance clauses that are built into them, and I'm wondering how. I would imagine that Philadelphia would have a higher percentage of Fannie Mae backed mortgages than a market where prices are much more expensive, like New York or San Francisco. Do you have any idea about that? Am I way off base in my thinking that maybe we might be more sheltered here than a more expensive market where the loans are jumbo loans or commercial loans?
All right, so to go why, you're correct. We would have a higher share of GSE loans here, both Fannie and Freddie. For those of you that don't know, they have something called a conforming loan limit, which is a cap on or ceiling on the total size of a mortgage that Fannie or Freddie will finance or buy. So that excludes the really high price cities like your New Yorks and San Franciscos. But even within the city, it's going to exclude the really affluent, high-income households. So I guarantee you, there are no $1 million condos in Philly that are financed by Fannie or Freddie, so they're not going to be affected by that forbearance clause. It's in there because the GSEs were created primarily to help low and moderate income households access greater financing. So yes, that will disproportionately affect cities that are not really high priced, and even within cities, that segment of the market which is not the luxury segment.
I have a question about inflation.
Be worried about it.
Yeah, I'm just wondering. I think obviously the economy seems like it's doing very well right now. There's a ton of money being pumped into the system. I mean, what are your thoughts on inflation and how that's going to affect the real estate market?
Well, here's what I and a lot of other economists don't understand about what the federal government is doing right now. So the economy is recovering. The housing market is doing incredibly well. The stock market's been doing reasonably well. But yet we're still pumping these massive stimulus packages into the economy. So last night, President Biden, mentioned he's got an American Act for this and an American Act for that. And these are trillions of dollars. Now, traditional, what we call Keynesian economics is that government should be increasing spending when the economy is in a downturn, not when it's in an upswing. So, it all started with FDR and the Great Depression and the New Deal. That was the whole purpose of the New Deal. And since then, that's generally been the policy of the government is, you increase spending during a recession because, when you fix more bridges and build more roads and employ more government workers, that's going to help out the economy and that will spur recovery. But when you increase spending, during a time when the economy is already recovering or doing well, basically you have what's called a crowding out effect. You've got federal money in the economy chasing resources that private money is all currently competing for, whether it be labor, materials, or things like that, real estate, what have you. So when you've got too much money chasing too few goods, that's when you get inflation. All right. So bottom line is, I am very concerned about not just these large increases in spending at a time when we're recovering, but these are massively unprecedented increases in spending. I mean, $1 trillion here, $1 trillion there. Remember, U.S. GDP is about $20 trillion. So if you increase annual spending by $3, $4, $5 trillion, now you've got the federal government, basically competing with private resources for as much as 25% of the economy. That's going to have an inflationary effect. It will take a while to work through because these bills have to be passed and the money has to be spent. So it's not going to happen next month or I think even the next 3 to 6 months. But a year from now, I could be very concerned about that. And of course, the reaction of that will be that the Federal Reserve will start raising interest rates. And that will definitely not only cool the economy, but that's going to cool the housing market as well because it's going to cause mortgage rates to go up as well.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Did the recent increase in material prices for builders have anything to do, in your opinion, with the increase in new construction?
No, like I said, the surge in new construction represents two things. One, yes, our home building community still remains bullish on Philadelphia. Okay, they're not pulling up stakes and moving to the suburbs. They remain bullish. But what they are doing is hedging their bets. Like I said, they're applying for their building permit before changes to the abatement take effect. Now, they may not have plans to actually break ground on that project until conditions improve that makes it worthwhile. For all I know, they're planning on building more luxury condos, but they want to see if the wealthy people are moving back to the city first. So they may be getting their permit now, but it could be 2, 3, 4 years before they break ground, if ever. I'm sure a lot of them are getting the permits almost just as a safeguard action. They maybe only have a relatively below 50% chance of actually following through on their project, but they'd rather get their permit now rather than later and have the benefits of the abatement with them. So I'm sure that's a big factor behind that surge. I'm guessing, no, you can back me up on that, right?
Oh, no, I had to step away.
Oh, okay. Okay, well, we're coming up on 3 o'clock. Maybe we can do 1 or 2 more questions.
So are there aggregated reports of general locations of where people in default are living, or is that not public information?
No, unfortunately, no, it's not public. We know those numbers at a national level, again, sometimes at a state level. But again, one of the reasons that the foreclosure numbers are not skyrocketing, even though the delinquency numbers are, is again because of the forbearance and moratoriums on that stuff that were imposed during the pandemic. Delaware has lifted theirs, and we've seen an increase there. So that's an indicator that, you know, eventually when it is lifted in Pennsylvania and Jersey, we'll start to see an increase in those numbers. But again, you know, predicting what the economy is going to do is tough enough for me. I can't predict what Governor Wolf in Harrisburg and the state legislature are going to do, or when they'll do it, which is the real question.
So with regards to the foreclosures or the delinquencies, I had a couple lenders send out videos saying that the federal government's going to effectively force the lenders to accept these forbearances and all the missed months. So if it's 12 months or 18 months, to be pushed on the back end of the loan, really not allowing a mass influx of foreclosures. Have you seen or heard anything to that effect, or I couldn't really tell if that was substantiated?
No, I haven't heard anything about that. You know, but if that does happen, if you're going to force the banks to eat the foreclosures, you know, banks don't hate owning real estate. I'll tell you that. Banks are in the business of, you know, borrowing money at 3%, lending it at 6%. Okay, they hate being landlords. It's not what they do. It sucks up a lot of resources. There's legal liability issues if a tenant hurts themselves. And believe me, a bank makes a much sweeter target for a lawyer than an individual landlord does. So banks don't want that exposure to liability. They don't want the time and hassle and resources of being landlords by putting foreclosures into REO. Okay, so what they'll do is they'll liquidate it, and they'll probably take a loss on it, because even that loss is smaller than the loss they would take on having to, you know, basically manage that property and be a landlord for it. So if that happens, then you could see a surge in sort of fire sale properties like we saw during the last downturn, which really brought out sort of the, you know, the opportunistic investors that snapped those up and converted them, you know, to rentals. So, you know, it is something I would keep an eye on if that does start to happen. There may be opportunities for you there for those of you that have investor clients or want to become investors yourselves.
All right. Kevin, we want to thank you for coming out today and sharing all these stats and great information with us. And we look forward to your next update.
My pleasure. And like I said, you know, another month or two, if you want me to come back and focus primarily on the suburbs, you know, I'd be happy to put something together for you.
Definitely. I'll touch base offline with you.
Okay. All right. Thank you, folks.
Okay, well, welcome back. So that wraps that up. Some great information. I was madly taking notes. Kevin's always got great insights. I appreciate, you know, his perspective as an economist, not just talking about housing. So I will post further information on my blog. Be sure to subscribe there. Be sure to subscribe up whatever channel you're on for future updates. And I'm always available to set up a FaceTime or a Zoom coffee or chat on the phone and touch base about what's going on in your micro market, because that's what really matters. We'll look at these trends and see how we can best navigate a changing market, because it is changing. As he brought up some great points about what could be going on with the economy in a year. So while sometimes it feels good to wait to take action, that may or may not be a good strategy. So thank you for your patience and your time. Until next time, please stay safe and take care.